Canada's agriculture industry employs tens of thousands of temporary foreign workers to help pick the produce that winds up on your plate. While many see this as a lifeline, a way to earn money to send to families back home, there are concerns the system is set up to exploit and, in some cases, abuse them. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Robert Cribb, founder and director of the Investigative Journalism Bureau, joins me to discuss the conditions under which these migrants work and how the system designed to help bring them here for employment may actually be setting them up for harm. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Rob, you and your team have partnered with Post Media and the National Post to work on a number of investigations so far this year. And I do want to talk about one specific one recently about migrant workers in Canada. But first, a bit of background for listeners. Tell us what is the Investigative Journalism Bureau and what kind of stories do you pursue?
Yeah, sure. The Investigative Journalism Bureau is a rather kind of unique newsroom. We're based at the University of Toronto, and it's really based on an entirely different model. It's collaborative. So we work with journalists, senior journalists, journalism students. We work with senior researchers and academics. We build a very big tent to tackle sort of big stories, big issues that sometimes takes, months, and in some cases we've worked years on stories. So we come together under this kind of unique shared, we call it radical sharing, where we all contribute research into a pot, and from that, everyone draws from it what they need for their purposes. So academics will do academic papers, we'll do obviously journalistic papers and stories. And what happened in May of this year is that we entered into a partnership with Post Media. So they effectively publish the work that we do across the network.
Mm-hmm. And how do you decide on what topics to investigate?
A timeless question. I don't know how we decide that. It comes down to, the instincts, I suppose, the spidey senses of our reporters. Stuff comes to us, for example, like we get brown envelopes and we get tips. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's personal experience. We, in the course of our lives, we come into contact with systems that we feel are not serving public interest, and we think, well, it could be an anecdote, could be a one-off, or maybe it's not. Maybe there's something systemic here. We spend a lot of time looking at the news. So it's frequently the case that when you read a news story, a short news story, it raises an anecdote, like an interesting event that occurred or a statement that was made. And we tend to treat that in journalism as a one-off. Right? Mm-hmm. We think, this thing happened, and we reported this thing, and that happened. There was a meeting, or there was an incident, and that thing happened, and we move on. Sometimes, though, you get the sense when you read those stories that, I've read this before. This seems to have happened a number of times. Totally isolated incidents that have occurred over the last month or a year or whatever it might be. And sort of the mindset of the investigative journalist is to start thinking about, are there connections? Are there lines to be drawn between these things? And if in fact there are, then it could be that there's a much bigger story to be told, not about one incident or one failure of a system or one death, but in fact a systemic issue that might be affecting thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people.
And looking at your most recent piece on migrant farm workers in Canada, how did that story come together?
It's kind of an example of the model. So we work with academics, as I mentioned, and there's one in particular who is the sort of distinguished academic in this field of labor. Her name is Geneviève LeBaron. She's at Simon Fraser University. And she came to us and said, I'm doing this project in BC Interior in Kelowna, looking at migrant farm workers there. They were doing surveys effectively with workers to determine living conditions, working conditions. What is it like to be a migrant farm worker from India or Jamaica working in Canada? And so we pieced together, we were interested in that because it is a massive issue of great public interest. This is the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, which you see ripped out of the headlines on a daily basis. There's great public debate and controversy about it. So we were interested in that. And so we effectively teamed up. I went to Kelowna for quite a while and spent my days alongside an academic researcher. We interviewed dozens of workers there. My two colleagues worked the agricultural areas of southwestern Ontario doing the same thing. And we spent several months digging into the practical on the ground realities as well as examining the temporary foreign workers system overall, filing access to information requests, speaking with lawyers and experts, and piece together what I think is a very comprehensive look at this particular area of the temporary foreign workers program, specifically agriculture. Mm-hmm. We know that, Canadians tend not to want these jobs or are unable or unwilling to do them, which has triggered this need to bring in 80,000 people a year. 80,000 people are brought in under this program, just agriculture. This is just work in the fields, picking fruit and producing food that ends up on your dinner table and mine. And so it is kind of an extraordinary thing, this program. And people feel quite strongly about it one way or the other, but it is real, and that, that work is being done overwhelmingly by people that we're bringing in under this program.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it's a topic that's on the minds of a lot of Canadians when politicians are trying to make political hay about whether to do away with this program. There's concerns about levels of immigration that are being raised by politicians, and so programs like this kind of take the spotlight. And when there's tens of thousands of workers in a specific industry, like in agriculture, you say 80,000 workers, that the experiences are going to vary, but I imagine that there are potential for problems. And before we talk about some of those issues, where are these workers coming from, and where are they most likely to wind up working in Canada? You mentioned BC, and for me, I'm out in Western Canada, and I know there's a lot of agricultural product being produced in BC, but where else are these workers winding up?
Well, they're coming from, let me tell you where they're coming from. The biggest number come from Mexico, Guatemala, Jamaica. We spoke with guys from Grenada, India. So they're coming from all over. They're ending up across the country for sure. Ontario's the biggest. Ontario and Quebec are the biggest. But BC is huge, like almost 13,500 this year, and it went to BC. Alberta, about just over 3,000. So it's across the country. I just think about where food is being grown, right? So Ontario, Quebec, BC, Alberta, for sure the biggest. So that's where they're ending up. They come under, most of them, let me say that, most of them come under something called a closed work permit. So what that means is the employer, typically a farm or a corporation, agricultural corporation, will sponsor them. And that means the companies, the employers pay the travel and the airfare. They give them housing and a salary. It's typically minimum wage Canadian salary, which for them, to a person, in our interviews, they said, look, it may not seem much to you guys, but to us, like it is dramatically more than what we can make at home. And we may not love leaving our families and our kids for 9 months or 8 months or in some cases 12 months, but the money that we make here can effectively fund our families and healthcare needs, etc., in a way that we can never do at home. So that's the basic trade-off. That's the deal essentially. Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, you were out in the interior of BC, and you were talking with workers on farms in BC, and when it comes to the conditions under which they're working, that I imagine that minimum wage, even though it's more money, there may be concerns about how people are working here. And what were they telling you about what they're seeing or what they're experiencing?
I think, as you rightly point out, there is a variety of views. So I would say there is definitely a constituency and a sentiment from them that I heard again and again, which is to say, like, we're grateful. Like, we're grateful for this opportunity. It feeds our families. And in many cases, they told me, my boss is pretty good. It's pretty good. They treat us well. There's respect. They understand the value of what we bring. There's a lot of experienced workers, a lot of very hardworking, highly skilled workers that come here and work for a level of payment that, it would be hard to find, I think. And so that there is a definitely constituency that said that this is a win-win. We think it's a win-win. It's obviously good for us, and it's good for the employers, and it's working. So there's that constituency. And then on the other end of that, I can certainly tell you that we heard a great deal of concerns raised. And it tends to focus on 2 or 3 issues. The most serious, I would say, is abuse, abuse, verbal and physical, a condescension and dismissiveness about these laborers from employers, threats of deportation. And here's an important piece of context that you have to understand. This closed work permit system that I mentioned, it leaves them very vulnerable. So they are very much tied to that one employer. So you can't show up here from Jamaica, go to work, find that you're in an untenable situation where you're facing lack of payment or the long delays in the payment or abuse or, decrepit living conditions. You can't move. You can't cross the street or the dirt road, so to speak, and go to a different employer. You are very much tied to this one company or individual. And that's perhaps the biggest grievance that those people who have had negative experiences, that's their biggest grievance. They feel that they should have the freedom to, as any other Canadian would have, to move to a different employer. It's complicated because there has been investments up front on the part of the employer. There's no doubt about that. They've spent money to get that person there. Mm-hmm. So then how do you do that? And it's a good question. But if there is a singular concern that is voiced by those who feel they have been exploited, and many do, it is that concern that they have no freedom. Many of them call it essentially indentured servitude to one person or company.
We'll be right back. You mentioned the word abuse, and I know some people listening may think, well, yeah, threats of deportation, that's a form of abuse. Decrepit living conditions is another form of abuse. But does the abuse take on harsh or violent forms? Are you hearing about physical abuse inflicted on migrant workers?
Yep, we definitely heard that. We heard lack of training that can be potentially deadly. So many of them complain about working in fields and greenhouses with pesticides that they know nothing about. They're not trained on them. And they have significant health conditions as a result of that, according to them. They would call that a form of abuse. Mm-hmm. Sexual assaults. In fact, one of the cases that we wrote about is an alleged rape that's now before the courts. So this is a young woman from Mexico who came here 2 years ago to BC and alleges that essentially her employer invited her and a couple of friends to his house on the weekend, and in the midst of a party and alcohol, she claims that he raped her, and that's an allegation which he denies, and it's before the courts. But we know from academic research that there is a particular vulnerability for women who come here under to work in agriculture in Canada. Wages. I mean, we heard a lot about wages. Either an unwillingness to pay the amount agreed upon, or just long delays. And you can imagine, again, this is a vulnerability issue. You're from Mexico and you're here to feed your family, and what these people typically do is every week they'll go into town and they'll do a money transfer to their wives or husbands at home. If that money's not showing up, that has very direct, real, and urgent consequences for them. And they would say it's also a breach of the contract and puts them in a very, very difficult position. So I would say that's the top array of consistent trending complaints that we heard.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that this is kind of a closed contract, that they can't, as you said, go across the street and find other employment. Are there any other factors that play into a system that kind of allows these abuses to happen?
I would say that's the one that they cite for sure. There's questions about. But let me stop here and say, what does the government say about all this? Because we spent a great deal of time making sure that we put all of this to the two federal ministries that are responsible for this. And so what they say is that these workers have the same rights and labor protections as any Canadian. Of course, there are abuses, and it happens across the country to all of us. It's certainly not specific to these workers. And when there are those abuses, there are mechanisms in place to deal with it. And that's all true, effectively, on its face. That's all true. Mm-hmm. But I guess what they would say, the migrant workers that is it's really not the same. There's language difficulties. There's a complete lack of awareness about what their rights are, unless they're connected to some sort of advocacy organization. Their ability to file complaints, show up to hearings, make arguments, is different than yours or mine, right? Yeah. It is a daunting process. You're working in many cases 12-hour days. When are you going to be doing that in a language you don't understand, citing legislation you've never been told about or ever read or can't read? So while you can sort of technically argue the rules and protections are no different than any other Canadian, practically speaking, it appears that's really not the case. There's great vulnerability. And so, there's advocacy organizations that have popped up in places like Kelowna that help. But, these are small, nonprofit largely, and the volume is not something they're equipped to handle. So, I guess I would just say the other factor in this is that the protection mechanisms that you and I have come to understand and enjoy and can cite when required are not available to them in many ways. Even if they exist, they are not available to them.
Yeah. As you mentioned, there is a system in place that's designed to enforce rules around the program, but is there a sense that employers are getting away with these kind of abuses without a lot of oversight? And in the event that employers are caught abusing these contracts and these workers, is there punishment for them? What happens to them when they're found to be abusing workers?
Yeah, it's a good question. We spent a lot of time looking at that question. So I think the fair assessment of that is there are cases where government, whether it be provincial or federal, do take action. They do. Like we wrote about two or three cases in our story that where a an employer was cited or given a series of orders to improve. There's some monetary fines. The federal government actually has the power to, of course, remove the ability for an employer to ever bring in another migrant worker. They've only done that a couple times, so the revocation element, the threat of revocation is pretty small. But I've seen fines of over $100,000 in some cases for breaches of the contracts under this program. So when they act through a complaint that is presented to them, you know, officially in English or French, yes, that can happen. I'll just tell you that the vast majority of the mostly men that we spoke with would never be equipped to go through that kind of bureaucratic process to even file a complaint. And then think about this a little further. Even if you could, let's say you're getting assistance, to file a complaint against your boss, who is your sponsor, comes with the obvious risk and concern that you are effectively ending your tenure in this country. Mm-hmm. Like, think about that. Like, in your job, I mean, imagine you're dealing with some untenable scenarios in your job, and the only way you can complain is to your boss, and you can work for no other boss. Mm-hmm. That is your boss. So you can imagine the reluctance to enter into this process. It is a tiny percentage who will ever do that. And as a result, I mean, the government can only do what the government is aware of, right? I mean, to be fair to them, you can't expect them to take action unless somebody showed up and brought some paperwork and some evidence and a clearly argued complaint. So if people aren't doing that because they're terrified, there's not much the government can do.
Yeah, it does put the government in a tough situation. There's been a lot of talk at the federal level about the temporary foreign worker program and whether we should just do away with it because of problems with it. People posting for jobs where surely a Canadian could do that job, and other issues. I guess twofold as we wrap this up. One, where would that leave farms struggling to attract Canadian workers? And two, does it distract from the need to improve the program that's there so workers aren't being abused?
Yeah, the one really important thing that I learned through this is you have to think of the temporary foreign workers program as a vast patchwork. It is a massive program. And agriculture is only, one piece of that program. And so I've read every story about grievances, about, workers taking over service jobs at the Canadian Tire and the Tim Hortons under this program. And those are jobs that lots of Canadians would want. And so that's a fair point, and I think that's a really important public debate and discussion. But even the critics of the temporary foreign workers program, like the Tories, the federal Tories, there's others, they tend to carve out agriculture. And I think we really do have to think about agriculture as a separate piece of the pie, which is unique. The truth is, and if you speak again both sides of the ledger on this. Farmers, agricultural corporations, they will tell you, no, we need this. There is no way we could meet production if we didn't have a foreign workforce available to us. So, I think that there has been acknowledgement. It never makes it into the stories, right? You don't read this piece of the puzzle when you're reading stories about the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, because we tend to talk about it as an omnibus thing. Mm-hmm. So whatever you think about other elements of the program that are bringing people in to work at Tim Hortons, whatever you think about that, you have to separate that from the workers who are coming to pick cherries in Kelowna, because nobody seems to have answered. Even the fiercest critics of the program seems to have answered what we would do if we scrapped that tomorrow. That would be a problem.
Yeah. Well, it's, I know it's a topic that's on the minds of a lot of Canadians, and also a really important topic when you talk about our record as a welcoming place for newcomers, especially in industries like this. Rob, I appreciate your work. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for doing it.
Thanks to my guest, Robert Cribb. More from him on this story at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.